The medieval world, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a place of castles and kings, but also of hunger and hard bread. Food, the very thing that sustained life, was both a necessity and a daily struggle. Forget feasts from movies and storybooks. For most people, eating in medieval Europe was not a pleasure, but a matter of survival. Picture a small village in the English countryside, the year 1324. A cold fog blankets the fields, where a thin harvest struggles to grow. In a wooden hut, smoke curls from the hearth where a woman named Alice stirs a pot of pottage, a watery stew of barley, onions, and whatever scraps she has left from last week's market. The smell is faint, almost disappointing, and her children sit around her with hollow eyes, waiting for their single meal of the day. This was life for peasants, who made up over 90% of the population. Their diet rarely changed. Pottage, black bread made from rye or oats, and perhaps, on lucky days, a bit of bacon fat or salted fish. Meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for lords and the clergy. Fresh fruits and vegetables existed, but in winter, supplies ran dangerously low. Malnutrition was not an exception. It was the rule. The wealthy, however, lived in a different world. Inside the stone walls of castles, food was a symbol of power. At a feast in King Edward II's court, roasted swans, spiced boars, and almond milk custards decorated long oak tables. But even here, things weren't as glamorous as they sound. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and saffron were imported from faraway lands and cost more than gold. They masked the taste of meat that had been salted or smoked for weeks, sometimes months. Refrigeration didn't exist, and food spoiled quickly. Imagine biting into a piece of venison at a noble's banquet, richly flavored with cloves and ginger, but beneath the spice lay the faint sourness of meat that was not truly fresh. Even the rich could not escape the reality of medieval preservation. For people like Alice and her family, food wasn't just bland, it was dangerous. Rye, a common grain, sometimes developed a fungus called ergot. When consumed, it caused hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Entire villages could be struck down by what they called St. Anthony's fire. Bread, the very foundation of life, could turn into poison. Salt was another essential problem. Preserving meat and fish required massive amounts of it, but salt was expensive and tightly controlled by local lords or monarchs. Wars were fought, taxes levied, and smuggling rings formed, all over salt. Without it, whole communities risked starvation in the long winters. And then there was famine. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe experienced what historians now call the Great Famine. Heavy rains ruined crops, grain supplies dwindled, and animals died from disease. In some places, people resorted to eating dogs, cats, or even the bark of trees. A chronicler from the time wrote chillingly that men ate the flesh of their children. In those years, Alice's family would have survived on anything they could find, nettles, acorns, or weeds boiled into thin soups. Starvation left people desperate, fragile, and open to disease. The irony was cruel. Europe's fields were vast, but farming methods were primitive. Wooden plows dug shallowly into the earth, crop rotation was poorly understood, and a bad season could undo years of labor. While today's farmer feeds hundreds with modern tools, one medieval farmer barely sustained his own household. And yet, despite the misery, there were moments of joy. On feast days, religious holidays that punctuated the calendar, villages came together. A pig might be roasted, ale brewed in abundance, and loaves of bread baked golden in communal ovens. For one day, bellies were full, laughter returned, and life felt almost good. But those moments faded quickly, and the long hunger resumed. In monasteries, monks experimented with brewing beer and developing cheeses, giving us some of the earliest traditions that survive today. Beer, often safer than water, became the drink of choice for peasants and nobles alike. Children drank weak ale, and adults consumed stronger brews daily. It was not indulgence, it was survival. Food in medieval times was a constant reminder of social class. The rich dined with silver spoons, their banquets designed to impress, while the poor scraped by with wooden bowls and whatever could be grown or gathered. Hunger drew the lines of power sharper than swords ever could. But not even kings were completely safe. Monarchs feared famine as much as their peasants, for hungry people rebelled. When bread prices soared, riots broke out. When grain shipments failed, rulers were blamed. Food was not only sustenance, it was politics, control, and survival. By the late Middle Ages, trade networks stretched wider. Ships brought sugar from the Mediterranean, rice from Sicily, and dried fish from Scandinavia. But again, these were for the wealthy. For Alice and her neighbors, daily life remained the same: black bread, pottage, and the endless worry of whether the next harvest would keep them alive. Still, something was changing. The introduction of new farming techniques, like the heavy plow and three-field system, slowly improved yields. Population grew. Town markets expanded. Food, though still hard and unappetizing by modern standards, became a little more secure. But as history would soon show, every improvement carried its own risks, and the shadow of hunger never fully disappeared. Alice's story, and the struggles of her family, echo across centuries. Behind every castle feast and royal banquet were millions of peasants who lived on the edge of starvation. Food, in all its scarcity and danger, shaped medieval life in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the question remains, as the Middle Ages moved closer to the Renaissance, did the meals of ordinary people ever truly improve, or was hunger destined to remain their most faithful companion? The story of Alice and her family does not end with the quiet misery of pottage and black bread. Their lives, like millions of others in medieval Europe, were shaped by forces far beyond their village: weather, war, kings, and the relentless hand of fate. In the spring of 1325, the rains had finally eased. Fields that had once been soaked and ruined by floods now carried the promise of grain. Alice walked alongside her eldest son, John, as they spread handfuls of seeds into the soil. The boy's face was thin, too thin for his 12 years, but his eyes carried a stubborn spark. Hunger had aged him faster than time itself. "Will it be better this year, Mother?" John asked, his voice low but heavy with hope. Alice hesitated before answering. Promises were dangerous. "If God wills it," she said softly. Her hands, rough and cracked, brushed against his as they worked. Behind them, the village buzzed with similar activity. Men guided wooden plows, drawn by weary oxen. Women scattered seed or tended to small gardens near their huts. Children fetched water from the stream, their laughter carrying faintly in the wind. Life in the village was harsh, but it was also shared. Neighbors leaned on one another because survival demanded it. That year, a tax collector came to their village. His arrival was as dreaded as famine itself. Riding a horse draped in fine cloth, he carried parchments marked with the seal of King Edward II. His voice boomed as he read the royal demands: more grain, more wool, more coin for the king's wars in Scotland. The villagers groaned in silence. They had nothing more to give. Yet defiance was dangerous. Alice's neighbor, a man named Hugh, muttered under his breath, but when the collector's eyes narrowed, Hugh lowered his gaze. Later that night, around a fire, Hugh whispered to Alice and a few others. "How can we feed our children if the king takes everything? He dines in London on venison while our children eat weeds." The bitterness in his voice was sharp, and though others agreed, no one dared to speak too loudly. Rebellion had consequences. Still, hunger pushed people toward desperate thoughts. While peasants wrestled with survival, monasteries nearby lived under a different rhythm. In the Benedictine abbey a few miles from Alice's village, monks tended gardens with surprising skill. They grew cabbages, leeks, and herbs. Their orchards produced apples, and their beehives offered honey. Though they lived by vows of poverty, their diet was far richer than that of peasants. Brother Matthew, a monk known for his gentle nature, often carried baskets of surplus food to the village. Alice remembered one winter when his apples had kept her children from starving. Yet even generosity was limited. The abbey could not feed everyone, and resentment sometimes simmered. Why should men who prayed all day eat better than men who labored in the fields? But Brother Matthew himself wrestled with guilt. In his journal, he wrote, We pray for the hungry, yet we dine with full bowls. The Lord tests us, I fear, with every loaf we break. By autumn, Alice's family finally reaped a modest harvest. Barley and rye filled their baskets. For once, the pottage thickened, and the children's cheeks regained a faint glow of health. Yet joy was short-lived. In November, rumors spread of an illness in nearby towns. Travelers spoke of fevers, coughing, and sudden deaths. At first, the villagers dismissed it as a tale meant to frighten. But soon, a peddler arrived with a cart of goods and a cough that rattled his chest. Within weeks, several in the village fell sick. Alice nursed her youngest daughter, Alice, through nights of fever. The child's skin burned hot, then turned clammy cold. They had no medicine, only herbs and prayers. Somehow, Alice survived, but others did not. Graves were dug hastily in frozen ground. Hunger had been the enemy for years, but now sickness marched alongside it. The connection between food and health was stark. Malnourished bodies fell quickest to disease. Those who had feasted in castles might recover, but the poor, weakened by years of thin broth and stale bread, often did not. Meanwhile, across the sea in France, a new invention was stirring change, the heavy plough. Unlike the light wooden ploughs of England, this iron-tipped plough cut deeper into the earth, turning heavy soil into fertile farmland. Merchants and travelers whispered about it, and soon, lords began importing the technology. One evening, the village reeve, appointed by the local lord, announced that a heavy plough would be brought to their fields in the coming year. The peasants gasped in awe. Such a tool could double their yield. But the reeve's next words chilled their excitement. With greater harvests comes greater tax, he said. The Lord will expect more grain. It was a cruel truth, every improvement meant the poor gave more to the rich. Still, not all was bleak. At Christmas, the village came alive. Though their meals were humble, each household contributed what little they could. Alice shared a small wheel of cheese, Hugh slaughtered a chicken, another neighbor brewed ale. They gathered in the largest hut, firelight dancing on weary faces. For one night, hunger loosened its grip. John, now 13, sang a carol he had learned from brother Matthew. His voice, clear and sweet, filled the room. Alice watched him with tears in her eyes, realizing he was growing into a young man despite the hardships. In his laughter, she saw defiance, a refusal to let hunger steal all joy. But beyond their village, storms brewed. England's war with Scotland dragged on, draining resources. Whispers of rebellion against Edward II spread among nobles. Famine had weakened the realm's stability. Food shortages were not just a peasant's misery, they were a king's nightmare. One bitter January morning, soldiers marched through Alice's village. They took grain, they took livestock, they took what little the villagers had stored for winter. John clenched his fists as he watched a soldier lead away their only cow. Alice held him back, whispering, "Do not fight them. Not now." But inside her, anger smoldered. Hunger had taught her to endure, but even endurance had limits. In the spring of 1327, everything changed. King Edward II was deposed by his own wife, Queen Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. News of his downfall rippled even to small villages. For peasants like Alice, little shifted immediately, but hope flickered. Perhaps a new rule would mean lighter taxes, or mercy in times of famine. That hope was short-lived. Taxes remained. War continued. And yet, something else was stirring, the growth of markets and towns. Traveling merchants brought goods from faraway lands, dried figs from the south, salted herring from the coast, even sugar for those wealthy enough to afford it. One day, John ventured to a nearby town with Hugh. There, he saw wonders, stalls piled with cheeses, baskets of eggs, and rows of smoked fish. He even glimpsed a nobleman's table laid with pies and sweetmeats. Hunger gnawed at him, but more than that, curiosity grew. What if he could escape the village? What if he could work in a town, where food was more plentiful? That night, he told Alice, "Mother, I want to see the world beyond our fields." Her heart ached at the thought of losing him. But she also knew the village chained him to endless hunger. "If it is God's will, you must go," she whispered, though her eyes brimmed with tears. As John dreamed of the future, famine threatened again. Heavy rains returned, reminding the village of the Great Famine just a decade earlier. Crops faltered. Bread prices soared. Alice found herself once again thinning her pottage, stretching barley into tasteless gruel. And then came word of a greater disaster, whispered first in markets, then shouted in fear, a plague, spreading from the east, moving through ports and towns, killing without mercy. Alice, John, and their neighbors did not yet know what awaited them. But hunger had prepared them for despair. As the shadow of the plague crept closer, food would once again decide who lived and who died. The winter of 1327 weighed heavily on the village. Snow clung stubbornly to the fields, burying any promise of spring. Alice sat near the hearth, feeding a slow fire with scraps of wood. The pot on the fire held nothing more than thin barley broth, stretched with dried nettles she had gathered in autumn. Her children slurped quietly, their hollow eyes reflecting the flames. John, now nearly 14, set down his wooden bowl. "Mother," he said, his voice steadier than before, "I will not stay here forever. There is nothing but hunger in these fields." Alice studied him. His shoulders had grown broader, his jaw sharper. He was no longer a boy, but she still saw the child she had rocked to sleep on long, cold nights. "The world is not kinder beyond these fields," she warned. "It may offer different food, yes, but also greater dangers." "I know," John replied. "But I must try. I cannot live and die in hunger." Alice wanted to argue, but deep down, she understood. Hunger had shaped her entire life. If John could escape it, even for a while, perhaps it was worth the risk. As winter dragged on, news traveled slowly, carried by weary merchants and wandering monks. They spoke of a sickness spreading through France and Italy. A plague, they called it. It began in the ports, killing sailors and townsfolk alike. Bodies were said to pile in the streets. Villagers whispered these stories by firelight, half believing, half dismissing them as distant horrors. But even before the plague reached England, the signs of disaster loomed. Bread prices rose as storms ruined harvests. Salt grew scarce, and fishmongers doubled their prices. For peasants like Alice, these changes meant empty cupboards and gnawing hunger. One evening, Hugh, the outspoken neighbor, stormed into Alice's hut. His face was red from the cold, but his anger burned hotter than the winter wind. "The reeve has ordered another tithe," he spat. "We give grain to the Lord, yet our children starve. Does the king know? Does he care?" Alice shook her head. "The king feasts while we suffer. He does not see us." Hugh slammed his fist on the table. "Then he must be made to see." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the danger of such words. Rebellion brought soldiers, gallows, and ruin. Yet as hunger deepened, so too did the courage, or desperation, to speak against lords and kings. Spring arrived, but with it came no relief. The rains fell endlessly, drowning seedlings before they could sprout. Villagers trudged through mud, their feet sinking as if the earth itself wished to swallow them. Alice tried to salvage what she could from her garden, but the cabbages rotted in the ground, and the barley grew thin and pale. Brother Matthew, the monk, came again to the village with baskets of dried beans and apples. His kindness was a balm, but his face was troubled. "The sickness is nearer," he warned Alice as he pressed food into her hands. "Ships in London carry it now. The abbey prepares, though how can one prepare for death itself?" Alice clutched the beans tightly. "Will it reach us?" Matthew's eyes darkened. "It reaches everywhere." By midsummer, hunger sharpened into fear. The first case appeared in a neighboring village. A farmer, healthy one morning, was dead by nightfall. His skin blackened, his body swollen. Soon, others followed. The plague had arrived. John begged his mother to let him leave. "If I go to the town, I can work for food. I can escape this sickness." Alice shook her head fiercely. "The towns are where it spreads fastest. Stay here, where the air is clean. But John's heart was restless. He had tasted the possibility of another life when he visited the market with Hugh. He had seen fish piled on stalls, meat roasting, bread stacked higher than he had ever imagined. The memory haunted him. To stay meant hunger. To leave meant risk. Alice feared both choices equally. The plague moved swiftly. Whole families vanished in days. In the abbey, monks fell sick one by one, their chants replaced by moans of suffering. Brother Matthew, though ill himself, continued to carry food to the village until he could walk no more. One morning, Alice found him collapsed near the stream, his body weak and his breath shallow. She knelt beside him. "Brother, you must rest." He grasped her hand with surprising strength. "Feed the children," he whispered. "Keep them alive." By nightfall, he was gone. The village buried him quickly, fearing the spread of sickness. Alice wept, not only for him but for the loss of one of the few who had cared. Fear gnawed at the village as hunger and plague fought for dominance. The reeve no longer came to collect taxes, perhaps he too had fallen ill. Soldiers no longer passed through. The outside world seemed to dissolve, leaving the village stranded in silence. And yet, amid despair, strange things happened. For the first time in memory, the villagers kept more of their own grain. The Lord's men did not come to take it. Those who survived the sickness found themselves with fuller baskets than ever before. Hunger did not vanish, but for once, the peasants tasted a kind of freedom. Hugh stood in the village square one evening and declared, "If the lords are gone, if the king's men do not return, then this land is ours. We till it, we sow it, we eat it. Let no man take it from us again." Some cheered. Others whispered that God would punish such defiance. Alice listened in silence, torn between fear and hope. John grew restless. He wanted more than survival, he wanted change. One evening, as he helped his mother prepare pottage, he spoke again of leaving. "If I can reach the town, I can find work with merchants. They say trade is growing even in these times. Food flows where money flows. I must see it for myself." Alice's heart clenched. She had already lost neighbors, friends, even Brother Matthew. To lose her son to ambition, or worse, to plague, was unthinkable. Yet she knew hunger was a chain he would never accept. She looked into his determined eyes and saw the reflection of her younger self, the girl who had once dreamed before hunger stole her hope. "Then go," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "But promise me this, remember us. Remember where you came from." John nodded, his jaw set. "I promise." The next morning, John left with Hugh, who shared his restless hunger for change. They carried only small bundles of bread and dried beans. Alice watched them disappear down the muddy road, her heart heavy with fear and pride. The village felt emptier without him. Yet in his absence, Alice grew harder, stronger. She taught her younger children to forage, to save every scrap, to endure. Each day was a battle, but each day survived was a victory. Months passed, and the plague raged on. Villages nearby emptied completely, their fields overrun with weeds. Wolves prowled where children once played. Yet in Alice's village, a fragile community endured. Hunger persisted, but the absence of lords and soldiers left them freer than ever before. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a figure appeared on the horizon. It was John. He was taller, leaner, and his clothes were ragged, but his eyes burned with fire. "Mother," he said as he embraced her, "the world beyond is worse than we feared, but also full of possibility." He spoke of towns where half the population had died, where houses stood empty, where food lay rotting in abandoned markets. He told of merchants desperate for labor, willing to pay wages peasants had never dreamed of. "The plague has killed so many," he explained, "that those who survive are needed more than ever. For the first time, peasants are bargaining with lords. We are no longer voiceless." Alice listened in awe. Could it be true? Could hunger, the curse of their lives, finally loosen its grip? But John's eyes darkened as he continued. "Yet it comes with danger. Soldiers patrol the roads, lords fight over empty lands, and thieves prey on the weak. Change is here, but it is not gentle. That night, Alice lay awake, staring at the low roof of her hut. The fire crackled softly, but her thoughts roared. Could this plague, as terrible as it was, also be the turning point? Could hunger, their oldest enemy, finally be defeated by the chaos of death itself? She did not know. But she felt the world shifting beneath her feet, like soil breaking under a new plow. And she knew one thing with certainty: their story was far from over. The autumn of 1328 settled over the village with a chill sharper than years before. Alice stood in her doorway, watching her son John speak with the gathered neighbors. His return had brought whispers, curiosity, and a stirring of hope among the villagers. The boy who had once scattered seeds at her side now spoke like a man hardened by the road. "The lords are weak," John said, his voice carrying across the small crowd. "The plague has stripped them of their servants. Markets in the towns are half empty, yet the merchants beg for hands to carry, to sow, to reap. For the first time, men like us may choose where to work, rather than bending under a single master." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. For generations, their lives had been bound by obligation: grain to the Lord, wool to the church, obedience to the king. The idea of choice felt dangerous, almost sinful. Hugh, standing beside John, added, "We have lived as cattle, yet cattle are fed better than us. If the lords cannot protect us, why should we bleed for their taxes? Why should we starve for their feasts?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Alice listened with a heavy heart. She saw the fire in her son's eyes, a fire that frightened her as much as it filled her with pride. She had lived her life in quiet endurance, but John sought something more: change. That winter, the plague loosened its grip, though its shadow lingered. Empty cottages dotted the countryside. Once thriving villages stood silent, fields untended, tools rusting in the mud. Wolves prowled freely, bolder than before. Yet the survivors, hardened by hunger and grief, began to rebuild. John urged the villagers to sow more grain than ever. "The land lies waiting," he said. "If we plant it, the harvest is ours. No reeve, no soldier, no lord to take it away." Alice watched her neighbors follow his lead. For the first time, the fields around their village bloomed with grain enough to feed more than just hunger. Loaves of bread grew thicker, pottage richer. The children's bellies filled, their laughter louder. The people of the village began to taste a freedom they had never known. But freedom bred new dangers. By early spring, riders appeared on the horizon. Their banners bore the colors of the local lord. The plague had thinned his ranks, but he had returned to reclaim what he believed was his. The villagers froze as the horsemen approached, hooves churning the thawing mud. The captain of the riders dismounted, his voice cold as iron. "His lordship demands his due. Grain, wool, and labor as before. Those who resist will be punished." Fear gripped the villagers. For years, obedience had been their only shield. Yet John stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We survived while you hid behind stone walls," he said. "The fields are ours now. We owe you nothing." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Alice's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to drag him back, to silence his reckless defiance, but it was too late. The captain's eyes narrowed. "Careful, boy. Insolence is a noose around the neck." Hugh stepped forward to stand beside John. "If you take our grain, we starve. And if we starve, who will sow your lord's land? Who will feed his table?" The villagers, trembling but emboldened, murmured in agreement. For the first time, they did not bow their heads. The riders exchanged glances, sensing the shift. The captain mounted his horse again, his voice sharp with warning. "This defiance will not be forgotten." As the riders retreated, silence fell. The villagers turned to John and Hugh, their faces a mix of fear and admiration. Alice gripped her shawl tightly. She knew the riders would return, and not alone. The months that followed were uneasy. The villagers worked harder than ever, storing grain, salting what meat they could, brewing ale in great barrels. Every meal carried both relief and dread. They knew the Lord's men would come again, perhaps with swords this time. Alice found herself at the center of the village's struggle. Her small hut became a place where decisions were whispered by firelight. She listened as Hugh and John debated, their voices low but urgent. "We must be ready," Hugh insisted. "If they come with force, we defend ourselves." John nodded, though his face carried a shadow. "But steel cuts deeper than hunger. If we fight, some of us will die. And if we yield?" Hugh countered. "Then we starve again." Alice spoke quietly. "Perhaps there is another way. Perhaps the plague has weakened them more than we know. If we endure a little longer, their power may crumble." Her words lingered, but the fire in John's eyes did not dim. He had tasted freedom, and he could not let it go. By midsummer, news arrived of greater upheaval. Across England, peasants whispered of rebellion. In towns and villages, men refused their lords' commands. Markets opened to free trade. Some lords, desperate for labor, offered wages instead of bondage. The world was shifting, one field at a time. John returned from another journey to the nearby town with stories that electrified the village. "Merchants pay coin for work," he said. "Coin, mother. With it, one can buy bread, meat, even cloth. No more waiting for a lord's scraps." Alice listened, torn between awe and fear. She had lived her life without coin, her survival measured in bowls of pottage and loaves of black bread. The thought of her son holding silver in his hands seemed almost unreal. But John's words carried a dangerous truth. The old order was crumbling, and with it came both promise and peril. One evening, as the sun sank red over the fields, the riders returned. This time, they came in greater number. Their captain's voice cut through the still air. "By order of his lordship, the grain of this village is seized. Resist, and you will hang." The villagers gathered, their faces pale. Women clutched children to their skirts. Men gripped tools, hoes, scythes, axes, not weapons, but all they had. John stepped forward once more, his voice steady. "We are not your serfs. The land is ours now. If you take our grain, you take our lives." The captain sneered. "Then your lives are forfeit." The riders advanced. Hooves pounded, steel glinted. The villagers did not move. Alice's heart thundered as she saw John raise his scythe, Hugh at his side. For a breathless moment, time seemed to freeze. And then, with a shout, the villagers surged forward. The clash was desperate, brutal. The peasants fought with raw fury, their hunger and grief driving them like a storm. Tools struck against armor, stones flew from slings, and voices roared with defiance. The riders, though trained and armed, faltered under the sheer will of the villagers. Alice stood at the edge, her hands trembling as she clutched her youngest to her chest. She watched John move through the chaos, his scythe flashing in the dim light, his voice shouting orders, rallying his neighbors. For the first time, she saw not just her son but a leader. The fight raged until the captain, bloodied and staggering, called for retreat. The riders pulled back, leaving behind broken lances and fallen men. The villagers stood panting, bruised but unbroken. Their grain remained theirs, for now. That night, the village gathered around the largest fire they had ever built. Smoke curled into the dark sky as voices rose in weary triumph. They had defied their lord and lived. Yet amid the joy, fear lingered. They knew this was not the end. The Lord would not forgive such defiance. Alice sat beside John, her hand on his shoulder. "You have changed everything," she whispered. "But the danger is greater now." John stared into the flames, his face lit with both determination and sorrow. "We cannot go back, mother. Not after this. We must move forward, no matter the cost." As the fire crackled and the villagers sang, Alice looked into the darkness beyond the circle of light. She knew the true battle had only begun. Hunger had always been their enemy, but now power itself stood against them. And in that moment, she felt the weight of history pressing down, as if their small village stood at the edge of a turning point that would shape generations. The world was shifting, and they were caught in its tide. The winter of 1328 gripped the English countryside with a cruel hand. Fields that once promised renewal now lay frozen, a reminder of nature's merciless rhythm. The villagers of Alice's hamlet gathered around hearths, their bellies gnawed by hunger, their minds clouded with fear of what the season might yet steal from them. Alice had grown harder these past years. Loss had shaped her just as much as hunger. She had buried neighbors, seen her children fall ill from spoiled bread, and stood in line at markets where merchants measured grain with a miser's eye. But she had also learned resilience. In her own way, she had become a leader. When the younger wives faltered, she reminded them how to stretch pottage, how to dry herbs for medicine, how to barter when coin was scarce. Her survival was not only her own, it had become the survival of many. Now, as rumors spread of yet another failed harvest, the village turned more often to Alice, whose quiet wisdom gave comfort. But comfort was not enough. The specter of famine demanded action. One evening, the villagers crowded into the church, their voices echoing beneath the wooden beams. A single candle burned at the altar, flickering shadows across the anxious faces. "We cannot endure another winter like the last," muttered Thomas, the reeve, his voice cracking under the weight of responsibility. "The grain stores are thin. The Lord demands a share, and the roads are too dangerous for trade." Alice stepped forward. "Then we must do what we have not done before. We must think beyond our fields. Beyond this village." Her words stirred unease. To step beyond meant risk, bandits, disease, the wrath of lords. But it also meant possibility. "What do you mean?" asked another villager, her hands wringing her shawl. "Other towns manage better," Alice said carefully. "Some have mills that grind more grain, or better plows. Others brew stronger alesh that keep men fed when bread fails. We have been clinging to old ways. But we can learn. We can trade differently. We can seek new knowledge." The villagers murmured, half doubtful, half intrigued. Change did not come easily to medieval minds, bound as they were to tradition and the church's teachings. Yet hunger pushed them toward hope, however fragile. In the weeks that followed, Alice led small groups to nearby towns. They walked miles across frostbitten paths, trading woven cloth for sacks of beans, herbs, and salted fish. In one market, Alice watched a blacksmith repair a heavy iron plow. Unlike the wooden ones her neighbors used, this plow could cut deep into the stubborn clay soil. Her heart quickened. "If we had such a tool," she whispered to Thomas, who had accompanied her, "our fields would yield more. We could break the ground that lies fallow and bring it to life." Thomas frowned at the cost, but he saw the truth in her eyes. "Perhaps we ask the Lord," he said reluctantly. "But he will want payment." Payment. The word weighed heavy. Their lord, Sir Geoffrey, was not known for mercy. Yet without risk, their hunger would only deepen. A week later, Alice stood in the cold stone hall of the manor. Sir Geoffrey sat in a carved chair, his hands heavy with rings, his cloak trimmed with fur. He looked down at her as though she were an insect daring to crawl too near. "You ask much," he said after she made her request. "An iron plow, a tool meant for serious farmers. And you think you, a peasant, can command such things?" Alice steadied her breath. "Not for me, my lord. For your land. More harvest means more dues for you, more tithes for the church, and less unrest among the people. Hunger breeds rebellion. You know this." Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. He was no fool. He had seen villages burn, men turn against their lords when famine struck. After a long silence, he leaned back. "Very well. But the plow will not come free. I will grant it if your village agrees to double its labor during my harvest." It was a cruel bargain, but Alice nodded. Better sweat than starvation. Spring came, and with it, change. The new plow carved furrows deep and true, turning hard soil into rich, plantable earth. The villagers sowed more grain than ever before, their hands blistered but their hearts alight with cautious hope. Alice worked beside them, her palms raw, her back aching, yet a spark burned within her, something greater than survival. And for the first time in years, the harvest was good. Golden fields swayed under the sun, and barns filled with grain that seemed to defy the memory of famine. Children laughed again, their cheeks fuller, their eyes brighter. Ale flowed, bread baked soft and warm, and the village sang songs that had long been silent. But abundance carried its own dangers. Word of the thriving village spread quickly. Travelers spoke of it on market roads. Neighboring lords grew suspicious. Was this small community hiding wealth? Were they cheating the crown's taxes? Jealousy and greed stirred like wolves at the scent of prey. One evening, soldiers arrived, bearing the crest of a neighboring baron. They demanded grain as tribute. When the villagers resisted, the soldiers raided the barns, taking sacks of wheat and leaving fear in their wake. Alice stood outside her hut, watching smoke from torches drift into the sky. Her heart clenched. Prosperity had not freed them, it had painted a target on their backs. The next days were heavy with dread. The villagers argued, should they hide their grain? Should they beg Sir Geoffrey for protection, knowing he might exploit them further? Or should they fight, though they had no swords, only sickles and plowshares? Alice listened, then spoke. We have endured famine, plague, and winter's cruelty. We have proven we can survive. But if we remain divided, stronger men will break us. We must decide, together, what we are willing to risk for the future of our children. The church bells rang that night, calling the villagers to council. The firelight flickered across determined faces. What had begun as hunger had become something greater, a fight for dignity, for control over their own lives. Weeks later, as autumn leaves fell, an uneasy alliance was struck. Sir Geoffrey, pressured by whispers of revolt and fearing the loss of his peasants' loyalty, agreed to defend the village in exchange for loyalty and taxes. It was not freedom, but it was a shield. The villagers kept their harvests, guarded their barns, and prayed that the coming winter would not undo all they had won. Alice, standing in the fields one misty morning, let the grains run through her fingers. She thought of the years of famine, of bitter pottage and poisoned bread, of her children's hollow cheeks. She thought of how food, so simple, so ordinary, had governed their lives more than kings or armies. And she realized something profound. Hunger had taught them fear, but it had also taught them strength. It had driven them to seek change, to stand together, to challenge even the order of lords and crowns. Food was never just food. It was power, survival, rebellion. As winter crept in once more, Alice knew the struggle was not over. Hunger would return, as it always did, in one form or another. But for now, the barns were full, the children slept with warm bellies, and hope, fragile but alive, lingered in the cold night air. The story of food in medieval times was not only one of misery. It was a story of endurance. Of ordinary people who carried history not with swords or crowns, but with the humble act of keeping hunger at bay. And in that small village, where Alice's name would be remembered long after she was gone, the truth was clear: survival itself was the greatest triumph of all.